Saturday, January the 3rd, 1981, Va'era. For several weeks we have been studying a traditional part of the Jewish service, which is found in the blue books in front of you, the traditional Siddur. We have been discussing the morning service, the Shacharit service. Without raising the question of faith or belief, that is to say, bracketing the entire question of whether one believes or whether one doesn't believe, but simply as one might study Hamlet or Macbeth. After all, the Siddur, the traditional prayer book, is in a sense more important to the Jew than the Torah, or even the Bible as a whole. In the Ark we have only the 5 books of Moses. As far as the balance of the Bible is concerned, it is true that we read the 5 Megillot, the Book of Lamentations, the Book of Ecclesiastes, the Book of Ruth, Song of Songs, on other occasions during the year. But apart from the Haftarot, apart from the readings from the prophets, which are read on Sabbath morning, most of the Bible isn't read at all by the average Jew. A Jew can be brought up in a well-ordered traditional home, and vast sections of the Bible can remain a closed book throughout his entire life. As a matter of fact, in the traditional yeshivot, it is frowned upon to study those parts of the Bible outside of the 5 books of Moses which are not used for liturgical readings. That is to say, if a student at one of the classical traditional yeshivot, the centers of Jewish classical traditional learning, was suddenly to decide to study the book of Joshua, from which about only 1 or 2 chapters are used in the entire cycle of the Jewish calendar, his teachers would look askance and frown upon it and try to talk him out of it. Very smartly, by the way. There's a lot of heresy in the book of Joshua. The traditional Jewish message must be seen in the alembic of Jewish tradition. And there are parts of the Bible which are not fit for Jews. That is the message that comes down from the traditional past, for very good reasons, which we don't want to go into right now. They raise questions about historical perspective. They raise questions whether Judaism was always the same, always and everywhere. They raise questions about whether God's mercies are in fact as merciful as we would like them to be. They raise questions about the contrast, the violent contrast between so-called Jewish ethics and the way God and the people of Israel behave in the Bible. And therefore, the Bible is censored by Jewish tradition. The 5 books of Moses, of course, are read once every year. Some parts of the 5 books are repeated because we read them on the occasion of the festivals. But, as I say, vast sections of the Bible, Book of Job, for example, Book of Proverbs, for example, never touched upon, except insofar as maybe some verses may form a pastiche or a mosaic and become part of the traditional Siddur. The Siddur is perhaps the most sacred book of the Jewish people. That is to say, more of the Siddur was read more regularly than any other traditional Jewish text. And of all the prayers that were read most regularly, the Shacharit service, the morning service, particularly the part that we have been studying, On Shabbat and Yom Tov, on Sabbaths and festivals, additions were made. But the actual format of the so-called text, as I have called it, we have been studying, is concerned, it was recited by traditional Jews and is still recited by traditional Jews verbatim. Every single day of the week, 365 days in the year. And no part of the Torah has that distinction. Except, of course, verses that are part of the Torah which find themselves in the traditional prayer book. Obviously, the Shema comes from the book of Deuteronomy, so that is read avidly morning and evening, and the verses that provide parts of the traditional service are also there. So, in looking at the Siddur, we are placing it in its proper context. However, not wishing to raise the issues of theology. Do we believe in these ideas? Do we believe in these concepts? There's the rub, of course. Here, especially at this Reconstructionist synagogue, many of us find it impossible to believe the classical myths, the classical legends, the classical truths, the classical concepts of Jewish theology. And we spend most of our time trying to interpret them in ways which are acceptable to the modern sensibility. So there is where we are at. And in our scratching of the surface of the Shacharit service, we've discovered some very interesting propositions, some very interesting insights. One of them in particular, which we've spent a great deal of time on, a sharp contrast in the first part of the service between what I described as a childlike preoccupation with novelty and detail and a very rigid and rigorous logical approach towards life, which seem to express the two ends of the spectrum of human life. It's almost as if the attempt is to try to help the Jew to unify his dreams and reality before setting out for his day's work. Or if that unification cannot be actually achieved, to at least present the opposition between dreamlike thought, a certain childlike approach towards reality, and the more rigorous logic which we need to deal with in our day-to-day lives, at least as a kind of a dialectic, as a kind of an opposition, as a kind of tension. So, for the benefit of those of you who are worshiping here with us for the first time today, we'd just like to draw your attention in the prayer book to the part that we have been dealing with, which gives rise to this notion. It's primarily to be found on page 15 and 17, the English translation on the opposite side. That is what I have called the childlike dimension of the first part of the morning service. And on page 41, we have the 13 principles of Rabbi Ishmael, which reflect the Aristotelian, or the logic, or the rational. We played around with attempts to place this opposition under a certain rubric, and none of the attempts that we made have as yet satisfied me. One of them, which I'm not happy with anymore, but at least I'll mention it, was the notion, of course, central to Freudian thought, that human beings are capable of two kinds of thinking, one which he calls primary thinking and the other which he calls secondary thinking. Secondary thinking, hopefully, is what we are doing now, that is to say, dealing with a text in, I hope, a rational and objective and detached, neutral way, and arriving at conclusions which hopefully anybody who approached the same text with the same kind of neutrality and scientific objectivity would arrive at. That is to say, we would draw attention to people to what we are saying, and they would be able to understand what we are saying and doing. Primary thought is the kind of stuff that takes place in dreams, where somebody who's been dead for 50 years talks to us as if he was actually there. But he also partakes of qualities of 18 other different people in our life. And the room in which the conversation takes place resembles our apartment, but also the home that we were brought up in Hoboken 45 years ago. So there's a slight complication. And the clothes and everything else seems to partake of a dreamlike quality. This is primary process. This is the language of fantasy. This is the language of daydreams. This is essentially the language of poetry. Now, this obviously is something to do with what we are talking about here, but it's only one thing to do. The great problem in trying to understand the realm of the spirit is that nothing has one cause. The only thing that I know of that has one cause is when one billiard ball hits another billiard ball. One can say that the movement of the second billiard ball is unicausal. That is to say, there's one single and simple relationship. But when you try to explain why people behave in such and such a way, when you try to explain why a certain poem is written in such a way, when you try to explain why Hamlet is written in the way that it is, when you try to explain why the Shacharit service is written the way it is, then we are not dealing with billiard balls. We are dealing with the human mind, we are dealing with the human spirit, and many different explanations intersect. Many different dimensional explanations intersect on the same line. You can have, on the same point, you can have a storyline, and intersecting the storyline, you can have a totally different interpretation of what the storyline is about. You may even have alternative interpretations of the storyline. You can interpret a poem without any knowledge of the man who wrote the poem or the woman, and you can find that the prime meaning of the poem is only explicable when one understands fully where the poet was at when the particular poem was written. And beyond those two explanations, there are a dozen more. Halo cho devarai ka'esh nu'umadinai uchafatish yefotzeitz sala. The rabbis loved to quote this biblical verse to describe what they understood by what I am talking about right now, which they called the midrashic process. Are not my words like fire, says God, even as a hammer that shatters a rock. This is a very graphic image. In other words, when you look at a fire, can you capture the image of a fire? I'm talking about a real log fire. The changing of the flame, the images that the flame elicits in our minds, the fantasies. You know, we've all looked at a fire, slightly drowsy, soporific, and imagined all sorts of dragons and caves and ancient battles and mythical enterprises being undertaken in the glowing embers. Are not my words like fire, says God? When you read the Torah, it's like looking at a log fire, and there is a reality there, but the essential genius of words of fire, by which we mean sacred text, by which we mean revelatory words, by which we mean words produced by men of genius, are they not like fire in the sense that in addition to the external reality, human beings are encouraged to interpret them? I'm sorry that our good friend Marshall McLuhan, whom we still don't quite understand, passed away last week, so maybe now we'll never understand what he meant by cool and hot. But at any rate, part of what he meant was that there are certain modalities in which we are asked, we are challenged by reality to give of ourselves. I don't think that is true when you play billiards, but that is not one of my fortes, and therefore I have no idea what kind of fantasies are experienced in the minds of those who go to pool, what are they called, pool halls? Pool halls. I don't think there is much, although you see one can be wrong. Apparently Mozart, when he was playing billiards, derived a great deal of musical inspiration. So you see, it depends on the person, but you have to be a Mozart to make midrash on billiards. The ordinary person, the ordinary average person in the street is not able to do this. The quality of a sacred text is you don't have to be a genius in order to be able to elicit meaning from it. And so here we have, obviously, one of the things that is going on in the early part of the Shacharit service. And there's no purpose in rushing because it's too complicated. I don't understand it well enough. I want to share my thoughts with you, and ultimately we're going to discuss this together. One of the elements is unquestionably this opposition between primary process and secondary process. There is no question at all about the fact that one of the things that's being done is that if the Shacharit service could talk to the Jewish people, it's saying, look, you've just woken up, and I know what it's like. It's rough. You have to get out into the world. One of the ways in which we're going to try to get you psyched up to go out into the world is, first of all, to go along with you where you are at. In other words, you're halb verschlafen. You're just in the middle of a dream, and the alarm clock ran. And if you're like most people, you put the alarm clock off and you've fallen asleep again. So we're going to sort of allow you to go through a kind of a half-dozed kind of condition in which you will get out of bed, but each time you do something, you'll make some kind of a conscious acknowledgement, not too much, just a little at a time, to kind of build up a sense of awareness. I envisaged 2 weeks ago, and in between I again want to thank Eddie Feinstein for having held the fort for me last week. 2 weeks ago I suggested it was a little bit like watching one of the ancient stately homes of England waking up in the morning from a distance as early dawn. A light goes on upstairs, another light goes on, another light goes on, the kitchen light goes on, the lights downstairs go on, and gradually the whole house is suffused with light and with activity. It's almost as if when the Jew wakes up in the morning, the Shacharit service says to him, we want you to start getting turned on in ever wider concentric circles. First of all, physically, you're there physically. The floor is there. Your clothes are there. You can go to the bathroom. You can wash your hands. You can start talking. Become aware that you're Jewish. Acknowledge the Torah. If you watch very carefully, the concentric circles move from the physical to the familial, to the spiritual, to the wider involvements of Jewish life, until finally, once the Shacharit service is underway, talking about major conceptions and myths, the crossing of the Red Sea, the affirmation of God's unity. In other words, from having woken up half asleep in the morning, one is standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, one is crossing the Red Sea, one is reaffirming the central myths of Jewish experience. It's a very slow process. It's like switching on the lights of a console, getting a computer to work up, getting a car to warm up on a cold day. You mustn't drive it off too quickly or the engine will die. You have to wait until a kind of warmth suffuses the entire machine, and only then can you with any certainty put your foot down on the accelerator, and even then gingerly. So there's undoubtedly something about this opposition between primary and secondary process thinking. The child that sees reality very starkly. The child who says, I got out of bed, I went to see if mommy and daddy were still there, I went to see if the dog was still there, I brushed my teeth, I had my breakfast, I had my Kellogg's cornflakes, I did this, I did... Children's books mirror this constant referral to the individual activities. There is a sense also of a liveliness. Hamachadesh b'tuvo b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh v'reishit is a sentence from the later part of the Shacharit service we haven't yet got to, which thanks God for renewing every day the work of creation. Most of us are so jaded that we don't notice this. We don't notice this. The child, through the child's eye, every time the child wakes up in the morning, the child sees the world created afresh. It's a new dog, it's a new house, it's a new table. The milk, the food, the porridge, whatever the child eats is new. And of course this has a good side and a bad side. The child can superimpose on this new reality, which is so sharp and so fresh, so unlike the reality that older people experience, his own fantasies. They can be good fantasies. They can be of princesses, of fairy queens, of magic paradise, of castles, of maidens with long golden hair who have romantic affairs with young men who know how to climb. But there can also be devils and dragons, and many a child is unable to cope with the other side of this experience, and that's what is a nightmare. And no adult can understand what a nightmare is. An adult can say, I had a nightmare last night, but that's not a nightmare. A nightmare is the nightmare that a child who's only beginning to get his act together and who experiences the world with all this intense reality, that nightmare of the child is unique, it is sui generis. A child drops a candy from its mouth, the world has come to an end. The second coming is awaited. That is the kind of intensity which we noticed in these blessings. A blessing hearing the cock crow to distinguish between light and darkness. Thanking God for enabling us to open our eyes, to move, to bend, to stretch, to walk. Compared to this very rigid, dry as dust detail on page 41, which tells us how we may use the reality principle to elicit laws from other laws. Let us then say this point very simply and very clearly, because herein lies a problem. And I say this as a dogmatic proposition. One of the things that is going on in the Shacharit service is the author's attempt to draw a sharp, radical distinction between a kind of perception which children have, which appeals to the child in us, and the more rational, logical, reality-oriented approach towards life which we are supposed to conduct our lives with. It really wouldn't do to go to the office and pull out a typewriter and start making a bracha out of getting a carbon and getting the top and getting the correcting fluid out and taking off the lid of the typewriter, a bracha over the telephone, the first telephone call in the morning. It wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't get very far in business. There has to be a reality there. Now, the assumption that I was working on was that in some way, in order to become prepared for the day, the traditional service was saying, before you do anything else, remember that you as an individual has a past. You have a past. Later on in the service, of course, we know quite obviously that what the Shacharit service is saying, you as a Jew have a past. That's why we read the song of Deborah, the crossing of the Red Sea. That's why we read all those Psalms. We know that later on in the service, the Jew is reminded, you have a collective group past. But what we detect in the first part of the service is, you have an individual past. Once you were a baby. Once you perceived reality in a very special way. One of you reminded me at the end of the sermon 2 weeks ago that there's a book by Selma Freiberg called The Magic Years, which I since read. I had the book lying around for many years, and it's a book where the author doesn't quote her sources. And of course, if you've read the sources, you will know where the book comes from. But nevertheless, no well-ordered parent of any race, color, or creed should be without Selma Freiberg's book. Anybody who has a child owes it to the child, if not to themselves, to read this book. And it's called The Magic Years precisely because of what we were discussing. That is to say, because children believe they are omnipotent and magical, and that they create a very special kind of reality, and that they experience reality in a very special way. And it is a shock for them to grow up and to realize that they were wrong. It wasn't their omnipotence that helped their being magicians. It was their parents, especially their mothers. And this great shock is a shock that no human being ever fully overcomes until the day of his death. We all still, in deep down, fondly yearn for those magical years where our wishes could transmute and transform reality. So I would like to suggest that those of you who are coming here on a regular basis for this discussion of the Shacharit service, read Selma Freiberg's book, The Magic Years, which is available as a paperback, I think it's a Scribner paperback, as a kind of a midrash on the Birchot HaShachar, an attempt to understand what exactly it was that the authors of the Shacharit service were trying to go back to. I'm very dissatisfied with the formulation thus far. I think it could be refined much more. But of one thing I have no doubt, that the contrast between the childlike quality of the early blessings and the rigorously logical quality of the 13 principles of Rabbi Ishmael are not found there accidentally. They were meant to shake us up and to stir us. The question I have to raise now is a question which arises out of a kind of a shock that I had last Saturday morning, reading a book review in the New York Times. I wonder, did anybody read that book review last Saturday, and did anybody have the thought that I had? No. Well, there we are. If you'd read it, you'd have known what I was talking about. Let me read the opening paragraphs of that book review. You see, I try to get away from it for a week, and it doesn't help, because just at the time when I was supposed to be giving the sermon, I was trying to relax. I opened the book review, you see, and I realized that you can't get away from the SAJ anywhere. It was a book by, and incidentally, I'm mentioning this simply because it complicates the issues that we have been talking about. You see, up to last Saturday morning, I thought that we had made a very simple statement. The Shacharit service was devised by men of genius who, without the benediction of modern psychology, understood that human beings cannot live in the present. There is no way to be human by living in the present. Whether you like it or not, you had parents. And whether you like them or not, you've got to come to terms with them. Because if not, they will haunt you till their dying day. And even if you come to terms with them, they will haunt you till your dying day. And that you are not born in Central Park, that you come from a tradition. And even if your parents ignored that tradition, your grandparents had it. And even if they ignored it, their parents had it. And somewhere along the line, if you really have the motivation, you can find some way of finding some member of your family who will tell you where you came from. And unless you ask that question, and unless you are genuinely motivated in having an answer to that question, you will not be living like a human being. You'll be living like a cabbage. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. That's what we are talking about right now. And this, of course, goes totally against the ethos of the 20th century and crucially against the ethos of 1980. We are the now generation. I know people who only know how to make instant coffee. They really don't know that there are beans and that you can grind them. And there's a benediction in smelling the aroma, freshly ground coffee. And there are 1,000,001 ways to do it. You can do it reform, you can do it conservative, you can do it orthodox, you can do it halakhic, non-halakhic, you can put together, have 16 different kinds of percolators. All they know is Nescafe or Maxwell House. And they conduct their lives like this, and their love affairs like this, and their marriages like this, and their raising of their children like this. Everything has to be now. Everything must be understood in terms of the present. The Jewish people are not exempt from this. There are Israeli Jews who believe that nothing happened between the year 70, when the temple was destroyed, and 1948, when the state of Israel was declared. They hate the intervening years, because the intervening years speak of Jewish vulnerability. They speak of the essence of what it is to be Jewish. And they hate that, because they believe that by force and power, and by guns and weaponry, and airplanes and naval ships, that we have wiped away what it means to be Jewish between 70 and 1948. Of course, that's absolute nonsense, but people have all sorts of fantasies in 1981. I said 1980, it has to move with the times. 1981, happy secular New Year to you all. You cannot live instantly. We have to be in touch with our origins. So there is no doubt in my mind that on one level, the authors of the Shacharit are saying, who are you? Where do you come from? What are you doing? Are you awake? Yes, we know you're awake. We know you're walking around, but are you awake? Are you there? Hello? That's what Shacharit says. Are you aware that your condition now is the way you used to be a long time ago? When you just thought by a fantasy, you could pretend that the alarm clock wasn't ringing. When you could alter the world just by making a noise, opening your mouth, waving your arms, and gods and goddesses, later to be known as the mortal, frail, clay-legged creatures as mother and father, came at your every whim and answered your every desire and aspiration. And when you have come to terms with the fact you were once like that, remember that you can't be like that anymore. You must be in touch with that, but you must live in the world of reality. We want to begin with to nod in the direction of where you came from, but once you leave the front door, you must live with reality. So obviously on one level that's what's being said, but is that all that is being said? Here is where my problem began, approximately 11 o'clock last Saturday morning. The New York Times was reviewing a book called Towers at the Edge of a World by Virgil Burnett. And the review begins with a quotation from a book written by a distinguished Dutch historian called Johan Huizinga, spelled Huizinga, a brilliant book written in 1924, which I have here, called The Waning of the Middle Ages. It's very interesting because this is a book in which Judaism has a great deal to learn from, because the reason why he called a book about the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries The Waning of the Middle Ages was because he wanted people to know that the present has a past, and that there was a great danger in people thinking of the modern world as beginning with the Renaissance. In other words, a kind of an instant change without any antecedents when people began to be sort of modern. And he deliberately called a book about the Renaissance The Waning of the Middle Ages, to remind people who read it, you have a past. You come from somewhere. You cannot understand the 15th century unless you also understand the 14th and the 13th and the 12th and the 11th and the 10th and the 9th. And Huizinga chose this title because, like the authors of the Shacharit service, he was also afraid, with great prophetic prescience, of instant history. In one of his marvelous images, I can't find it right now, but it's somewhere in this book, I know I marked it, he says, you can't possibly study history like fillets of haddock. You have to look at the whole fish. He says, people talk about, or you call it filet, don't you? Filet. I call it fillet. So we all just had to put up with fillet for this morning, right? He says, talk about the Maccabean period and the Roman era and the Dark Ages and the medieval period and the Renaissance and the modern age and the pre-modern, the postmodern. It says they were fillets of haddock, that you just get the fillet out of the freezer and try to study, but it's not. It's part of a living fish. And all is related with the whole. You cannot understand history in segments. And one of the great dangers is that young people especially, but old people also, when they hear these catchphrases whereby historians try to make a grab bag of something that really cannot be made a grab bag of, which makes an artificial delineation between before and after, much like biblical and ecclesiastical, or ecclesiastical and rabbinic and modern and postmodern. There is more that unites these different phases in history, these artificial phases, than separates them. More that unites the medieval period and the modern period than separates them. At any rate, Broyard says, he quotes the first two, actually I thought it was the first two paragraphs of The Waning of the Middle Ages, but I'm very suspicious, and I went back to the original and it's not. I'm surprised that he didn't indicate that it's a jump. I want to actually read the opening page of The Waning of the Middle Ages. And I think you'll immediately see why I was so struck by this reference to Huizinga by the reviewer. And incidentally, of course, the book is very simply a collection of mock medieval fables centering on an imaginary hilltop town in southern France. It sounds very exciting, and I will put it away with the 89 other books that I put away 5 years ago to read during the summer, and hopefully we'll get round to it one of these days. Why doesn't one have the guts to wait for the paperback to come out? Why does one delude oneself into thinking that if one buys the hardcover, one will read it any earlier than the year or two later when the softcover comes out? To the world when it was 500 years younger, he's talking about 1500, the outlines of all things seemed more clearly marked than to us. The contrast between suffering and joy, between adversity and happiness appeared more striking. All experience had yet to the minds of men the directness and absoluteness of the pleasure and pain of child life. Every event, every action was still embodied in expressive and solemn forms. Every event and every action. I'm thinking now actually of not Moshe Chaim in the Pripyat marshes getting up in the morning and making the brachot. I'm thinking of Louis XIV getting out of bed in the morning. Has anybody ever read a description of how Le Roi Soleil got up in the morning? There was a functional equivalent of a benediction even for the potty. So therefore, everything came under the scrutiny of what we have thought was something unique to Judaism in the Birkat HaShachar. It was not merely the great facts of birth, marriage, death, bar mitzvah. That was just for Daniel. It's not there. It's not. Huizinga didn't talk about bar mitzvah. It was not merely the great facts of birth, marriage, and death, which by the sacredness of the sacrament were raised to the rank of mysteries. Incidents of less importance, a journey. Do you know that in traditional Judaism there is a prayer for going on a journey? It's called Tefillat HaDerech. Did you know that? so that even when you go on a journey, Orthodox Jews to this day, you can see them at the Kennedy airport davening their heads off before they take off. But in the Middle Ages, Tefillat HaDerech, before you go on any kind of a journey, you have to make a prayer. Actually, I think there should be a special prayer. Orthodox Jews should do this, maybe Reconstructionists should, for traveling by subway. Not just the big things were sanctified. A journey, a task, a visit were equally attended by 1,000 formalities, benedictions, ceremonies and formulas. At this moment, as they say in Greek, is geworden finster for the Eugen, because I suddenly realized that the Birchot HaShachar about which we were talking, may well reflect the childhood of man. Each and every one of us individuals' childhood, but something else has entered into the picture which we cannot ignore. Apparently, and I raise this very delicately and tentatively because I'm not sure this is true, there were certain periods when the same quality which we have perceived existing in the Birchot HaShachar existed as a collective sensibility of a whole era. And the question we now have to raise is this: was this medieval? Because the traditional Shacharit existed before the Middle Ages. We are talking about the Talmud. The Talmud is 4th, 5th century. But what the Talmud enshrines is rabbinic. And this goes back to the 2nd and 3rd century, which by no stretch of imagination can be called medieval. So the question now is this childlike? We have to find a good word for it, which is not insulting and not pejorative, but expresses a quality where everything is experienced with an excitement, where when you lose your lollipop, Armageddon has arrived. No, Armageddon has arrived when your brother steals your lollipop. This is what Brayard left out, and I wanted to read it because it's very, very relevant to what we are talking about. Calamities and indigence 500 years ago were more afflicting than at present. It was more difficult to guard against them, to find solace. Illness and health presented a more striking contrast. The cold and darkness of winter were more real evils. Honors and riches were relished with greater avidity and contrasted more vividly with surrounding misery. We, at the present day, he's talking about 1924, can hardly understand the keenness with which a fur coat, a good fire on the hearth, a soft bed, a glass of wine were formerly enjoyed. Then again, all things in life were of a proud or a cruel publicity. Lepers sounded their rattles and went about in processions. Beggars exhibited their deformity and their misery in churches. Every order and estate, every rank and profession was distinguished by its costume. The great lords never moved about without a glorious display of arms and liveries, exciting fear and envy. One can't help thinking about that little magazine called People. You know what I'm talking about? Where they have the front section dealing with the people who are in, and a back section dealing with people who are out. Nothing, you see, I'm beginning to raise myself in my mind the question of whether what we call fondly medieval isn't medieval at all. That in fact, not only are the Birchot HaShachar, this is the heart of the problem, an attempt to get us in touch with the childlike dimensions of our individual origins as human beings, as individuals, but also draws our attention to, for want of a better word, the medieval qualities of every era and every generation. That is to say, somehow, although we are not aware of it, there is no such thing as the Maccabean era and the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. That in every era, depending where you are, what your space is, where you are looking at, there is a medieval space. Today, right now, 1981, there is a medieval space in our American society, in our Jewish society. There is a medieval point. There is a modern point. There is a postmodern point. But we are not all at the same place. I was going to say we all look alike, but we don't. We don't dress alike. This glorious display of arms and liveries is not just a function of the medieval era. Look at the preoccupation on the part of certain people with wearing certain kinds of clothes. Is there not a functional equivalent between the lords and ladies who walked around with a glorious display of arms and liveries exciting fear and envy in the 15th century, with Brooke Shield, who walks around with Sassoon tattooed on her... Is it Sassoon? I'm sure it can't be. What is it? I'm sorry. All I notice in these ads is Brooke Shields. I don't know what else is going on. It's very hard to notice it. Even babies have Vidal Sassoon tattooed on their tochuses today, I understand. Is that not the case? I mean, where could you get what we're calling the medieval dimension more? That even babes in arms have to wear the hallmark, the livery, the insignia of rank. You know, in America, that goes for class. It's a form of aristocracy, isn't it? The aristocracy of the diaper. Executions and other public acts of justice, hawking, marriages and funerals were all announced by cries and processions. The lover wore the colors of his lady, companions the emblem of their confraternity, parties and servants the badges of their lords. The contrast between town and country was very marked, and so on and so forth. The contrast between silence and sound, darkness and light, summer and winter, more strongly marked than it is in our lives. The modern town hardly knows silence or darkness in their purity. Well, we did, didn't we? Although it wasn't intended. Denizens of New York City did learn the hard way about the reality of darkness in a way for which, unlike their medieval counterparts, they were not prepared. Courtesy of Con Edison. Two well-known blackouts which made us begin to feel what it might have been like to live in the absolute darkness of the medieval town. The modern town hardly knows of silence or darkness in their purity, nor the effect of a solitary light or a single distant cry. And finally, the last brief paragraph, which was quoted by he quoted the first paragraph, but not the interim stuff. All things presenting themselves to the mind in violent contrasts and impressive forms lent a tone of excitement and of passion to everyday life, and tended to produce that perpetual oscillation between despair and distracted joy, between cruelty and pious tenderness, which characterized life in the Middle Ages. I'm not sure whether this is only characteristic of the medieval world. Anyone who watches the news on television, anyone who reads the evening papers, knows that the essence is tragedy. The essence is violence. And as a matter of fact, in a sense, this is even more violent. It's more violent for a television interviewer to shove a microphone into the mouth of a woman whose husband has just been shot by some mugger on a subway train, and insist through the privacy of her tears that she presents some kind of meaningful statement to millions of people. Is there any difference functionally between apparently our urge to expose the most intimate sensitivities of people and the lepers who advertise their wares in medieval churches? It seems to me that what we've done is blind ourselves by these rubrics and adjectives and wrappings, and fail to see that we are not so different from our forebears, that we too, in our way, seek out what we have called the medieval in what happens today. There are descriptions here of men sentenced to death who make speeches to the people who gather around the funeral pyre while they frizzle and fry. One such young man, a murderer and an incendiary, addressed touching words to the spectators, and so he softened their hearts that everyone burst into tears, and his death was commended as the finest one that was ever seen. Could I ask whether any of you has any chord at all in your mind struck by this idea? Were not two of the most important books on this theme, I can't tell you books that I read with any kind of relish, come along now, you know what I'm talking about, Truman Capote's book In Cold Blood, which was precisely medieval in this sense. The man who on death row made a television appearance, or at least made a speech of some kind, No? The woman on Central Park West who committed suicide recently but made a whole sermon and had a party. The equivalence between that and what Huizing is talking about here is unequivocal. What is this distinction, medieval and modern, that we are talking about? And finally, of course, when anybody had to be hung, drawn, and quartered, they had to wear their robes of state. Here is Jean Saint-Peur, I hope his Saint-Peur remained with him on the guillotine, placed high on a cart preceded by two trumpeters. He's on the point of having his head chopped off. He wears his robe of state, his hood, his cloak, his hose, half red and half white, his gold spurs. They are left on the feet of the beheaded and suspended corpse. Now, I can't help thinking in these descriptions of how people are put to death with their robes of office, of the Watergate trial on television, when part of the joy and the delight and the schadenfreude that the people who watched had was to see the high and mighty, not exactly in their insignia of office, unless Brooks Brothers suits and rimless glasses or a particular kind of a haircut, but nevertheless people whom we fully knew to be surrounded by the glory of office, being executed, being tortured, being tormented. And one final very brief sentence. In more than one respect, life still had the colors of a fairy story. That is to say, it assumed those colors in the eyes of contemporaries. I think it's so obvious that we are going to have to extend our understanding of the Shacharit service. But there are two more brief references to this book which I cannot leave you without today, because they strikingly to me draw attention to what we are talking about. And again, I apologize for the somewhat haphazard mode of presentation. This is the only way I am able to present this material at this moment, because I don't understand any more than you do about what it means. One is a description in this chapter of what happened when the great itinerant preachers of the Middle Ages came to Paris. People used to do exactly what they do today when a rock singer comes to town. Do you know what they used to do? They used to sleep in the churchyard in freezing cold in Paris overnight to make sure they had good seats. I saw an article a few days ago about why New Yorkers line up in sub-zero temperatures to go to see a new movie. Did anybody see that? Was it the New York Times on Sunday? Where was it? It's a study. I mean, New York is the only place where people do that. They regard it as a badge of honor to stand and freeze to death in order to be able to say at the next cocktail party they go to, oh, did you see? Oh, yes, well, I did. And, they want for the next few hours they're ahead until the next movie comes out. You can get pneumonia that way in winter if you don't watch out. Is this so much different? My father, God rest his soul, told me about how he experienced the Kamnitzer Maggid. Kamnitzer Maggids was one of the great darshanim of the late 19th, early 20th century. My father described how he would wait in line outside the synagogue immediately after services ended on Shabbos morning in order to have a chance to get in, because there were no loudspeakers in those days. But why did I have to go to the Kamnitzer Maggid? Go to Broadway any day of the week and see people literally lining up in sub-zero temperatures to get a ticket for this play or for that play, not to miss out, not to feel culturally deprived. This again is an equivalent. And now one final equivalent which maybe doesn't have modern equivalents. But then again, I am not so sure. This is a little story which Huizinga tells about a medieval mystic who lived between the years 1296 and 1366, called Heinrich Suso. I'd like to read the entire paragraph about this man. He was a Swabian mystic who at the age of 14 joined the order of the Dominicans and became a pupil of Eckhart, who was one of the famous medieval mystics. He is described by one of his biographers, I'm not quite sure what he means, as the most attractive of the Rhineland mystics. I'm sure that the author of the biography wasn't referring to the cut of his robes. Obviously, it must refer to the content of his mysticism. Apparently, there was attractive mysticism and unattractive mysticism in the Middle Ages. The unattractive mysticism apparently dealt with the more obsessive-compulsive mystics who believed in doing all sorts of things which are not really a fit topic of discussion on Saturday morning. So I leave them. If you want to ask me afterwards during the Kiddush, I will whisper them in your ear. But he was one of the more attractive of the medieval mystics. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, two factors dominate. By the way, I want you to listen to this not just as telling you something out of a book. I want you to listen to this with all the reverberations of what we have been talking about in the synagogue about Judaism and about the Shacharit service. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, two factors dominate religious life. The extreme saturation of the religious atmosphere. Isn't that a lovely phrase? It's like a glass of saturated solution where one more drop of salt and you're going to get crystals. The extreme saturation of the religious atmosphere. Only somebody who was, I was going to say afforded the privilege, but I would like to qualify that, brought up in an Orthodox Jewish home, will understand what I mean when I talk about an extremely saturated religious atmosphere. Does anybody in the congregation know what I'm talking about an extremely saturated religious atmosphere, where any moment a crystal is going to form? Usually it's going to be thrown at you. The intense crystallization, extreme saturation, and the marked tendency of thought to embody itself in images. Individual and social life in all their manifestations in the Middle Ages are imbued with faith. There is not an object, not an action, however trivial, that is not constantly correlated with Christ or salvation. Not an action, not an object, however trivial. We are in the Birchat HaShachar. There's not a single object, nor action. Getting out of bed, putting your feet on the ground, putting your robes on. It has to be correlated with Christ or salvation. Equals for us, make a bracha. All thinking tends to religious interpretations of individual things. All thinking tends to religious interpretation of individual things. There is an enormous unfolding of religion in daily life. This spiritual wakefulness, however, results in a dangerous state of tension, for the presupposed transcendental feelings are sometimes dormant. And whenever this is the case, all that is meant to stimulate spiritual consciousness is reduced to appalling commonplace profanity, to a startling worldliness in otherworldly guise. Some Orthodox synagogues come under that rubric. Everything is meant to make for the spiritual, but unfortunately the spiritual is forgotten. And so the motions are gone through, the words are said, the actions are performed, but there is a total lack of the inner spirit. Only saints are capable of an attitude of mind in which the transcendental faculties are never in abeyance. The spirit of the Middle Ages, still plastic and naive, longs to give concrete shape to every conception. Every thought seeks expression in an image, but in this image it solidifies and becomes rigid. By this tendency to embodiment in visible forms, all holy concepts are constantly exposed to the danger of hardening into mere externalism. For in assuming a definite figurative shape, thought loses its ethereal and vague qualities, and pious feeling is apt to resolve itself in the image. Even in the case of a sublime mystic, like Henry Suso, the craving for hallowing every action of life verges in our eyes on the ridiculous. I wonder if Huizinga had been given a copy of the traditional prayer book, would he have thought that the Birchat HaShachar, in their obsession with giving a benediction to every single act that you perform when you get out of bed, would verge on the ridiculous? He is sublime, this mystic writer, when following the usages of profane love, he celebrates New Year's Day and May Day by offering a wreath and a song to eternal wisdom, his betrothed. Or when out of reverence for the Holy Virgin, he renders homage to all womankind and walks in the mud to let a beggar woman pass. But what, asks Huizinga, are we to think of what follows? When he sits at table, Suso, the mystic, eats 3/4 of an apple in the name of the Trinity, and the remaining quarter in commemoration of the love with which the Heavenly Mother gave her tender child Jesus an apple to eat. And for this reason, the last quarter of the apple he eats with the skin, with the paring, as little boys do not peel their apples. Here is an identification with the childlike behavior which is acted out in leaving the skin on the apple to make it absolutely clear that one is identifying with the child. After Christmas, he does not eat it, for then the infant Jesus was too young to eat apples. When he drinks a glass of wine, he drinks it in 5 draughts because of the 5 wounds of the Lord, the 5 wounds traditionally which were in Jesus' side on the cross. But as blood and water flowed from the side of Christ, he takes his last draught twice. Huizinga comments sardonically, this is indeed pushing the sanctification of life to extreme. I wonder if Huizinga ever visited a Hasidic commune. I wonder if he ever was in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, how he would react. Because anyone who knows anything at all about Jewish life knows that change the words, take out Trinity and put in something else, and we have Yiddishkeit in all its marvel. That is to say, anybody who has ever heard rabbis discussing, Orthodox Jews discussing, whether if you drink a glass of milk and a cookie, whether you should make the bracha over the glass of milk first and over the cookie second, or you should make the bracha over the cookie first and the glass of milk second, or you should mix the cookie and the milk together, make a bracha over porridge, or you should go for a walk and not have either. Knows exactly the religious atmosphere in which this discussion takes place. Yesterday I chanced to hear an intriguing conversation between 2 young people about the Beatles. And I listened to it for a while, and then suddenly I sat up with a shock. Apparently on some records of Beatles, which were published before John Lennon was assassinated, the initials of his assassinator appear. Apparently in certain songs by the Beatles, for those who are able to understand, or in the words of our medieval Tosafist, V'hamevin Yavin, the connoisseur will understand, there are subtle references to the drug cult, to where it's at right now. Stephen, would you like to come and join me up here and tell me what you know about this subject, please? Do you know what I'm talking about, Stephen? I want you to come up and help me. I mean, I need a lot of material here. What I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that you don't have to study Talmud with Rashi and Tosafot in order to be able to think in the way in which this young man and his colleagues and the people I heard talking to yesterday think. What I'm suggesting is that we are dealing with a new kind of gematria, simply referred to a different subject. What do you know on this?
The Beatles had a fair amount of songs, one which many people know, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which stands for LSD, and they had...
Get a load of that. Get a load of that. That's exactly what the rabbis used to do with the Chumash when they noticed the reason why we say Vayichulu Hashemayim V'Haaretz on Friday night. Do you know that? On Friday night, why we say Vayichulu Hashemayim V'Haaretz? Because the acronym Vayichulu Hashemayim, Yom HaShishi Vayichulu Hashemayim, are the 4 letters of the name of God, Yad Hei Vav Hei, like LSD. You'll excuse me. Please carry on.
And in that song they have... in the song they have many connotations to strange things that happen when you're on drugs. And in a movie, a cartoon movie, The Yellow Submarine, they sing the song and they have this lady flying through the sky with all sorts of twinkles going on and lights flashing all over the place, which I've heard is the same thing that happens.
I'm glad you stopped us there.
Same thing that happens.
Nothing that you say here will be taking down evidence against you. So this is sanctuary, yes.
Yeah, which is the same thing that happens when you're on drugs. And the Beatles, I don't know if they did it on purpose. They gave a story that said that one of the Beatles' sons drew a picture of a person named Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, but personally I think that when they wrote the song they're thinking more of drugs than his child.
Have you heard of Puff the Magic Dragon?
Yes.
Yes. Do you know any Rashi on that one?
Nope.
No. Okay. Thank you very much, Stephen. Huh? Come on. The Bar Mitzvah boy wants to share his knowledge with us this morning.
The song Hey Jude, they're talking about letting something under your skin and into your heart to make everything feel better.
Thank you very much. Do I have any more material on this subject? May I make the proposition that this mentality, I'm going to use the word medieval again because I don't have another word. This is ridiculous. This is not a medieval phenomenon. In every generation, there are people who are not satisfied with what we Jews call pshat, the literal manifest meaning of a text, but insist on reading into it things which are not there. But also those who are gifted and write the pshat, that is to say the manifest level of the story, often, both consciously and unconsciously, wittingly and unwittingly, incorporate into what they are writing hidden allusions, metaphors, acronyms, insights, which are only meant to be understood by the cognoscenti, those who are in the know. So that, for example, Mama doesn't understand what Puff the Magic Dragon is about, but the teenage child is supposed to. And the very fact that the child knows something that the adult does not know gives it this added pleasure. The very fact, for example, that the Gnostics, you see, the very word Gnostic, the name of a classical, ancient, medieval sect, and modern, of course, those who claim that they know a special kind of knowledge which the others don't know. See, this was very true of the 60s. The point I'm making is that it's also true of the here and now. It's now 12:10, and I really feel that I am going to have to simply leave this point right in the air here. Herb Kaplan is going to lead us in a few moments of discussion or questions. If people want to ask questions, we'll, I don't know, is a discussion now? I think we should try at least if somebody has extra material they'd like to bring in on this. But I just want to make it quite clear that I was absolutely fascinated to realize that the entire approach of Midrash, you don't have to have a Jewish sacred text or a Christian sacred text in order to have Midrash. That the human being has a deep-seated need to relate midrashically to life, that life operates on a dialectical sense. I don't have to tell you that I intend to continue with this theme next week, now do I? Thank you very much. Herb, would you like to come up?
Shabbat Shalom. I'm Herb Kaplan, and I want to extend a welcome to the Bar Mitzvah family and to our other visitors here today. We are now at the portion of the service where we invite members and guests to react to the Rabbi's talk. There's just a few ground rules. State your name, let us know whether you're a member or a guest, and keep your comments to a few minutes and keep them relevant. The Rabbi will not respond to any comments as is his custom, because he'll refer to it. He may refer to your comments sometime in the future. The microphone is now open.
My name is Hyman Scher. I suppose you all know me. I came here to express my thanks and gratitude to my friends in SAJ who have shown the true spirit of Jewish V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha in time of stress. You have shown your great love and your great concern to those who are here and to those who are not here, especially to my good and dear friend Rabbi Alan Miller, Harav Rabbi Zev ben Moren Harav Reb Aryeh Leib, and to my good and beloved friend Eliezer ben Zisha. To all of you, I wish you a long life and good health, and nachas from your children in their accomplishment and Yiddish nachas. Thank you very much.
My name is Sarah Lee Rose, and I'm a member of the congregation. I'd just like to explain something to Rabbi Miller that I don't think he understands. He made much too much of a generalization about waiting in lines. It's one thing to wait in line for a movie and pay the full price and have to wait. For those of us who are poor, we choose to wait in line for a reason at the half-price ticket stand.
I'm Joel Shapiro. I'm a member of the congregation. And I would like to comment about what Rabbi Miller said concerning if he had his option, he would have everyone wait until they were 13 and then start to teach them. I think one of the things that would necessarily happen with that is you would only wind up starting at the point where you're discussing how to interpret Torah. You would miss that full childlike part of the experience. I don't think you can start at the intellectual. You have to start with the childlike first and then progress to the intellectual.
I'm Myron Bassman, a member of the congregation. I think one of the things the rabbi has been talking about, I guess it's now for 6 weeks, is essentially what does this all mean to us, and not just intellectually, but experientially. What does it mean to daven the Shacharit service 365 days a year? I mean, does it have any meaning? Does it have any feeling to it, and so on? And it occurred to me 2 weeks ago that there was something that was comparable to that in my own life. I mean, I couldn't daven every day no matter what. I've tried it and it's not comfortable. It has no meaning whatsoever. However, there is, for me, and I don't know, not the word analogy, something is similar to it. And it's the radio. It's something I've been playing with in my mind from what the rabbi has been saying, because the ritual for many of us to get up in the morning is the radio. And I would venture to say that one would have to look at the programming on the radio stations to see what kind of music is played for getting up. For instance, I listen to WFM in the morning, and you must listen to Bruce Springsteen at 7:15 in the morning, otherwise you can't get up in the morning. Everybody here who listens to WFM knows that. You got to get your shot of juice, and that's what he calls it. Now, I assume that functions on other radio stations as well. And that the morning kind of wake-up and movement through the day is the same thing. Many people can't work anymore without having our music on. For instance, the idea of I sit and listen to a radio station all day also, and I can hear the same songs day in and day out, and they have a certain kind of smoothing effect on my ability to function throughout the day. And I venture to say one of the things that happened when John Lennon died, in the way he died, is that it was an extreme religious movement that has developed among a certain group of people who share their inner experiences on the public airwaves. And those experiences, when you talked about Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, we knew that 15 years ago. That was LSD. We can go through all the albums that we have that were part of my experience in growing up. It goes back until you go back to the 50s rock and roll. There was a change. And the music has made a tremendous change in the way we react. I grew up as a teenager in Brooklyn, and if those of you who remember the song Duke of Earl, sounds silly and so on, it expressed a certain set of feelings for a certain set of people that could not be found in the synagogues, the churches, the schools, etc., in the standard establishment institutions. And I venture to say that when I hear We Shall Overcome or sing it linked with other people's arms, or even hear the song Imagine that John Lennon sings, or some of the other things that are part of my growing up, they have more emotional power than almost anything else that happens to me in my life, including most of the prayers that happen in the synagogue. And I think that maybe we should examine, I understand what the rabbi is saying is that these have had it in the past for other people. And I have to say they don't have it for me now. And that there really is something else that has it for me. And I'm part of this American culture. And many of us here have grown up the same way. If you go to a Bob Dylan concert, it ends the same way now every time. Everyone lights a candle. 10,000 people stand up and light a candle and sing Forever Young. If you go to a Pete Seeger concert, you link arms at the end and you sing We Shall Overcome. It is not fortuitous that those things are happening among a certain group of people. I don't know what it means, essentially. But I know that it is in conflict with what goes on here. The fundamentalist ministers of the Midwest and of the South have always ranted and raved against rock and roll. And I think, in a sense, they know something.